You don't belong here, and I'm not wasting another second pretending you do." The words cut clean across the polished marble lobby of Sterling National Bank at exactly 10:12 a.m., sharp enough to silence the low hum of printers, footsteps, and quiet conversations that had filled the space just moments before, and every head turned not because of the volume, but because of the certainty behind it, the kind of certainty that assumes authority without ever needing to prove it. And standing on the receiving end of that certainty was Jada Sterling, dressed in a simple charcoal sweater, dark jeans, and low heels, nothing designer, nothing loud, nothing that matched the unspoken image of wealth the room had been trained to recognize. And that was intentional, because Jada hadn't walked into this downtown Chicago branch to be recognized. She had walked in to observe, to test, to see what happened when power entered a room without announcing itself. And now she had her answer unfolding in real time. The bank manager, a tall woman with a crisp blazer and a name badge that read Claudia Reeves, stepped forward with the kind of posture that suggested she had done this before, her eyes scanning Jada not as a client, but as a problem to be removed. And around them the atmosphere shifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A man in a navy suit lowered his coffee cup halfway to his lips. A young teller behind the counter froze with her hands hovering over the keyboard. And somewhere near the waiting chairs a phone subtly tilted upward, recording without permission but not without reason. Because something about this moment felt familiar, rehearsed even, like a script too many people had seen play out before. And yet Jada didn't move, didn't raise her voice, didn't rush to defend herself. She simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, absorbing every detail the way she had trained herself to do years ago when rooms like this had tried to shrink her into silence. And for a brief second, just a flicker, a memory surfaced, a younger version of herself, standing in a different bank, different city, same look in someone else's eyes, the same assumption wrapped in polite language. And then it was gone, replaced by the present, sharper, clearer, more controlled, because this time she wasn't here to endure it, she was here to understand it. And Claudia took another step closer, voice lowering just enough to sound professional, but not enough to hide the edge beneath it, asking for verification, for proof, for justification that no one else in the room had been asked to provide. And that was when the tension thickened, not loud, not explosive, just heavy, like a storm building without thunder. And somewhere behind the counter a junior employee hesitated, glancing between Jada and the manager as if caught between instinct and instruction, almost speaking, almost questioning, but stopping short, because the hierarchy in the room was clear even if the truth was not. And Jada noticed that too. Every hesitation, every glance, every unspoken doubt, cataloging it quietly, because this wasn't just about a single interaction anymore. It was about a pattern, a system, a culture that revealed itself not in policies written on paper, but in moments like this, unscripted yet entirely predictable. And still she said nothing. Because silence, when held with intention, has a way of making everything else louder. And right now, everything in that bank was speaking volumes. Claudia Reeves did not wait for a response because in her mind the decision had already been made and the room had already agreed with her, even if no one had spoken it out loud. She gestured lightly toward the counter with a practiced motion and said, "We are going to need full verification before we proceed with anything you are requesting," and her tone carried that same quiet authority that often went unchallenged in spaces like this. But Jada Sterling remained exactly where she was, unmoved, her posture unchanged. Her eyes steady not on Claudia's face, but slightly past it, as if she were already seeing beyond this moment into something larger, something inevitable. And that alone unsettled the balance of the interaction, because people who are unsure tend to fill silence with explanation, while people who are certain let silence do the work for them. And Jada said calmly, "I am here to access my account and complete a transaction, and that should be straightforward." Her voice even, controlled, not defensive, not confrontational, just factual. But Claudia's lips pressed into a thin line, as if the simplicity of that statement irritated her more than any argument would have. And she responded with a sharper edge, "This is not a walk-in service desk, and we do not process high-value requests without proper clearance." And there it was, the shift from procedure to presumption, subtle but unmistakable, because no one had asked what the amount was. No one had checked the system. And yet the conclusion had already been drawn, and behind them the tension continued to spread through the room like a ripple in still water. A man near the waiting area leaned forward in his chair. A woman by the glass offices exchanged a glance with the teller beside her. And the young employee who had hesitated earlier swallowed hard, her fingers hovering again over the keyboard as if she wanted to type something that might change the direction of what was unfolding. But she did not move. Not yet. And then Claudia added almost casually, "If you cannot provide immediate verification, we will have to ask you to leave." And that word leave landed heavier than it should have, because it was not just about space, it was about belonging, about who was allowed to exist comfortably within these walls and who was expected to justify their presence. And for the first time a faint murmur moved through the room, quiet but present, because people recognized the tone even if they pretended not to. And still Jada did not react the way they expected. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not hesitant, and pulled out her phone. The motion so controlled it drew attention without demanding it. And she glanced at the screen for a brief second before lifting it to her ear, not hiding the action, not performing it either, just doing what needed to be done. And when she spoke, her voice was low enough that only those closest could hear, but clear enough that the intention carried across the room. She said, "Initiate internal review for branch 047. And there was a pause on the other end before a response came back, steady and professional. "Confirmation received, beginning review now." And Claudia frowned slightly as if the words did not fit the script she had already decided this moment would follow. She crossed her arms and said, "If you are calling someone to verify your identity, you can do that outside of the building." And a few people shifted at that, not because the instruction was unusual, but because the timing of it felt off, premature, like a decision made before evidence. And that was when the junior employee finally spoke, her voice hesitant but audible. "Excuse me, I can check the system for her name. It will only take a second." And the words hung in the air longer than expected because they introduced something the room had not accounted for: doubt. Not loud enough to challenge authority directly, but strong enough to expose the gap between what was being said and what could be verified. And Claudia turned her head sharply, just enough to silence her, without raising her voice. "Not necessary." She said, "We follow protocol, and protocol requires proper identification before any system access." And the employee nodded, quickly retreating back into stillness. But the hesitation had already done its work. It had cracked the surface just enough for others to start seeing what was underneath. And Jada ended the call without another word, lowering her phone with the same calm precision she had lifted it. And for a moment nothing happened. No alarms, no announcements, no visible change. Just the quiet continuation of a normal morning in a bank that did not yet realize it had already begun to shift beneath its own foundation. And then somewhere behind the counter a screen flickered, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough to make the same junior employee glance down again, her brow furrowing slightly, as if something on that display did not align with what she had been told to expect. And across the room the man in the navy suit slowly set his coffee down, no longer pretending this was just another routine interaction, because the silence had changed. It was no longer empty, it was waiting. The flicker on the screen did not make a sound, but it shifted something in the room that words had not yet reached. The junior employee leaned in closer to her monitor, her eyes narrowing slightly as lines of data refreshed in a pattern she had not initiated. And she hesitated again, this time not because she was unsure of herself, but because she was beginning to understand that something larger was already in motion. Meanwhile, Claudia Reeves remained fixed in her stance, arms crossed, posture rigid, as if holding her ground could somehow stop whatever quiet change had begun behind her. She glanced briefly toward the counter, noticing the subtle movement, but choosing to ignore it because acknowledging it would mean admitting she did not have full control of the situation. And control was the one thing she could not afford to lose in front of a room now fully attentive. Every person present had shifted from passive observer to silent witness. Phones were no longer discreet, some were openly raised. Others held low but angled just enough to capture every word, every expression, every misstep. And Jada Sterling stood at the center of it all, still composed, still silent, her presence no longer blending into the environment, but defining it. She did not need to speak because the space around her had begun to respond in ways that words could not command. And then the junior employee finally broke the silence again, her voice quieter this time, but carrying further because of what it implied. "Ma'am, I think there is a system flag on this account." And Claudia turned sharply, irritation flashing across her face. A flag for what she asked, her tone clipped precise. The employee hesitated, glancing back at the screen, as if confirming what she was seeing before saying, "I am not sure, it just says executive-level review required." And the phrase landed differently than anything said so far, because it did not accuse, it did not question, it simply introduced a level of authority that did not belong to anyone currently speaking. And for the first time, Claudia's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those watching closely. A slight tightening around the eyes, a brief pause before she responded, "That is internal language, it does not apply here. Continue with standard protocol." But her voice lacked the same certainty it carried moments ago, because protocol was only effective when the system supported it, and now the system itself seemed to be rewriting the rules in real time. And behind the counter, another screen refreshed, then another, a quiet chain reaction moving through terminals that had been stable just seconds before. One teller leaned back slightly, whispering to the colleague beside her, "My system just locked me out of client access." And the colleague checked her own screen, nodding slowly, "Mine too." And the words spread in hushed tones, not loud enough to disrupt, but strong enough to ripple through the staff like a current. And across the room, the man in the navy suit stood up completely, now no longer pretending to be uninvolved, his attention fixed on Jada, as if trying to place something about her that suddenly made sense. While near the glass offices, a woman in a tailored dress lowered her phone, just enough to speak under her breath, "This is not normal." And still Jada remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, not on the screens, not on the staff, but on Claudia, because this moment was no longer about the system, it was about the person who had chosen to act before understanding. And Claudia felt that shift. She could feel the room leaning away from her authority and towards something she could not yet define. So she took a step forward, attempting to reclaim control, her voice sharper, now louder than necessary. "This branch operates under my supervision, and no external interference will change that. If you cannot comply with our requirements, you will need to leave immediately." And the word immediately echoed slightly in the space, not because it was loud, but because it felt forced, disconnected from the reality unfolding around it. And that was when the junior employee spoke again, this time without hesitation, her voice clear, firm, almost surprising even to herself. "The system just escalated the flag. It now says branch-level audit in progress." And that sentence did what no raised voice could do. It stopped everything. The subtle movements, the quiet whispers, the internal justifications, all of it paused as the weight of those words settled into the room. And for a brief second, no one spoke, no one moved. Because an audit was not a suggestion, it was not a possibility, it was a process that came from above, and when it began, it did not ask for permission. And Claudia's eyes flicked toward the screens, then back to Jada, her expression no longer just irritated but uncertain. Because somewhere deep beneath her training, beneath her authority, beneath the structure she relied on, there was a realization forming, slow but undeniable, that this situation had never been under her control. Not from the moment Jada Sterling walked through the door, and now the room knew it too. The silence that followed the words "branch-level audit in progress" did not feel empty, it felt heavy, like the air had shifted into something that could not be ignored or explained away. And Claudia Reeves stood there for a fraction of a second longer than she should have, her posture still upright, but no longer anchored in certainty. Because authority only works when it is believed, and in that moment belief had begun to fracture. She glanced toward the nearest terminal, as if expecting it to correct itself, to return to the familiar structure she understood, but the screen did not change. Back it remained, locked on the same message, confirming what the room had already begun to feel, that something above this branch had taken control. And behind the counter, the junior employee straightened slightly, her hesitation replaced by a quiet clarity. As she read from the screen, "It says all transactions are temporarily paused pending executive review." And the word executive did not belong to anyone in that space, yet it carried more weight than any title present. A teller to her left whispered under her breath, "This is corporate level." And another responded, "No, this is higher than that." And their voices did not rise, but they did not need to, because the meaning traveled through the room faster than sound. And across the polished floor, the man in the navy suit took a slow step forward, his earlier detachment gone, replaced by a focused attention, as if he were watching a moment unfold that he would later try to explain. but never fully capture, and near the glass office a woman lowered her phone completely, now no longer pretending this was casual, because it was not. It had become something else, something irreversible. And still at the center, Jada Sterling had not moved, her calm no longer just a personal choice, but a contrast to everything unraveling around her. And Claudia finally spoke again, but the edge in her voice had changed. It was sharper, yet thinner, as if stretched over uncertainty. This branch will continue normal operations, she said firmly, override whatever system message you are seeing and proceed. But no one moved. No keys were pressed, no screens changed, because the instruction no longer matched the reality in front of them. And the junior employee looked up, meeting Claudia's eyes for the first time, not defiant, not confrontational, but certain. I cannot override this, she said. It requires executive authorization. And that word landed again, executive, like a signal from somewhere unseen, but undeniable. And Claudia exhaled slowly, her composure tightening, as she shifted her attention back to Jada, as if the answer must be standing right in front of her. You made that call, she said, her tone now less commanding, more searching. What exactly did you do? And for the first time since entering the bank, Jada spoke more than a single sentence, her voice still controlled, but carrying something deeper now. Something that did not need to be raised to be felt. I did not do anything, she said. I allowed the system to respond. And that answer did not satisfy Claudia, because it removed the possibility of control. It suggested that what was happening was not an interruption, but a correction. And behind them, another screen refreshed, this time with a soft tone that drew immediate attention. The words regional access suspended appeared across multiple terminals in sequence. And one of the tellers leaned back slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. My login just expired. And another echoed, mine too. And the pattern was no longer subtle. It was visible, undeniable, cascading through the branch in real time. And a quiet murmur spread through the customers, now not just curiosity, but recognition, because systems like this did not shut down without cause. They responded to authority, to ownership, to something far above the level of a single manager's decision. And Claudia felt it. She felt the room shifting away from her completely, now not out of defiance, but out of realization. And she took a step forward again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if recalibrating her position in a situation she no longer fully understood. If this is some kind of escalation, she said, then it will be handled through the proper channels. You do not get to disrupt operations here. And Jada's gaze met hers fully for the first time, not confrontational, not emotional, but absolute. And she replied quietly, operations were already disrupted the moment you decided who belonged here and who did not. And the words did not echo loudly, but they settled into the room with a weight that could not be dismissed, because everyone present had heard the earlier statement. They had seen the assumptions, the tone, the decision made before any verification, and now those moments were no longer isolated. They were part of something larger, something being examined in real time. And near the counter, the junior employee looked back at her screen one more time, then spoke again, her voice steady, this time no hesitation. The system just updated. It says executive presence confirmed on site. And that sentence changed everything, not because it explained what was happening, but because it narrowed it down to a single undeniable fact. Whatever authority had initiated this was not remote. It was here in the room. And slowly, almost instinctively, eyes turned toward Jada Sterling, not all at once, but in a gradual, undeniable shift, as the pieces began to align in ways that no one could ignore any longer. And Claudia did not turn immediately. She held her position for one more second, as if refusing to follow that same realization, but the silence around her left no alternative. And when she finally looked back at Jada, it was no longer with assumption, it was with uncertainty edged with something else, something closer to understanding. Because for the first time since this began, she was no longer asking Jada to explain herself. She was beginning to realize that she might have to. For a brief moment after the words executive presence confirmed on site settled into the air, no one spoke, because no one needed to. The meaning had already begun to rearrange the room, not physically, but perceptually, as if every assumption made in the last 10 minutes was being quietly reevaluated in real time. And Jada Sterling remained exactly where she had been from the start, her stillness no longer blending into the background, but standing in contrast to the subtle unraveling happening around her. And Claudia Reeves felt it fully now, not as a suspicion, but as a realization forming piece by piece. The tone she had used, the conclusions she had drawn, the authority she had exercised, all of it now sitting under a different light. And she took a slower breath this time, her posture adjusting, not collapsing, but recalibrating, as if searching for a position that still made sense in a situation that no longer followed her expectations. And she said carefully, almost choosing each word. Before letting it leave her mouth, if there is an executive present, then they should identify themselves so we can resolve this properly. And the request sounded reasonable, structured, even professional. But it carried something else beneath it, a need to restore order on her terms. And the room remained quiet, not because no one could answer, but because everyone was waiting for the same thing. The confirmation that would either stabilize or completely shift what was left of the moment. And Jada's gaze moved slightly, not dramatically, not performatively, just enough to acknowledge that the question had been asked. And she said, "I agree." Clarity is important. Her voice steady, measured, and for the first time carrying a tone that suggested conclusion rather than observation. And as she spoke, a memory surfaced, not loud, not overwhelming, but precise. She was 27, standing in a regional office after closing her first multi-million-dollar deal, dressed professionally, prepared beyond expectation, and still being asked to wait while others walked past her without question. She remembered the way the room had felt, then the quiet dismissal, the assumption that presence did not equal authority. And she remembered deciding in that moment that one day she would build something where presence would never have to ask for permission again. And now, standing here years later, that same pattern had presented itself in a different form, but with the same underlying belief. And she let the memory pass because it no longer held power over her, it only informed her. And back in the present, the junior employee looked between Jada and Claudia, her expression no longer uncertain, but alert, as if she were witnessing a moment she would later describe with careful detail. And behind her, another system tone sounded soft, but distinct, and a new line appeared across the screen's executive authorization in progress. And that phrase did not escalate the tension, it focused it, narrowing the room's attention to a single point. And Claudia noticed it too, her eyes flicking briefly to the display before returning to Jada, and this time there was no attempt to mask the shift in her expression. The certainty from earlier had been replaced with something more cautious, more deliberate. And she said, "If you have access to executive authorization, then you should present your credentials now so we can proceed." And the phrasing was different, not dismissive, not accusatory, but no longer in control either. And Jada took a small step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward resolution. The movement subtle, yet enough to draw every eye in the room fully onto her. And she reached into her bag again, not hurried, not hesitant, and removed a slim black card, holding it between her fingers for a brief second before placing it gently on the counter. The sound of it meeting the polished surface was soft, but it carried. Because in a room this quiet, even the smallest detail became significant. And the junior employee leaned forward instinctively, her eyes widening slightly as she read what was printed on it. And she did not speak immediately, not because she did not understand, but because she did. And she looked up slowly, her voice lower now, but clear enough for everyone close to hear. "This is an executive access credential." And the words did not ripple, they landed, firm and final. And Claudia's gaze dropped to the card, then back to Jada, and for the first time since this began, there was no interruption, no immediate response, just a pause long enough to acknowledge that the situation had moved beyond assumption entirely. And Jada said quietly, "You asked for identification, this is it." And there was no emphasis, no performance, just a statement placed exactly where it needed to be. And the room held that moment collectively, not with shock, not with noise, but with a recognition that something had shifted beyond return. And in that stillness, the earlier words, "You do not belong here," echoed differently, now not as authority, but as a mistake that could no longer be contained within a single conversation, because it had already triggered something much larger, something that was now fully present and impossible to ignore. The moment the card touched the counter, the balance of the room shifted completely, not with noise, not with sudden movement, but with a quiet certainty that replaced everything that had come before. The junior employee did not reach for it. Immediately, her eyes remained fixed on the name etched into its surface, as if confirming what she already understood, but had not yet allowed herself to say out loud. And when she finally picked it up, her hands were steady, but slower, more deliberate than before. She turned it slightly under the overhead lights and read carefully, "Jada Sterling, Executive Chair, Sterling Financial Group," and the words did not need to be repeated for their meaning to settle into the space. Because Sterling was not just a name, it was the name on the building, the name on every document, the name that defined the institution itself. And the realization moved through the room, not like a wave, but like a shift in gravity, pulling every assumption downward at once. And Claudia Reeves stood still, her gaze locked on the card now in the employee's hand, her expression no longer guarded, no longer controlled, but processing, recalculating every decision she had made since the moment Jada walked in. And she said nothing at first because there was nothing immediate to say that could restore the authority she had relied on just minutes ago. And the junior employee looked up, her voice lower now, but carrying further than before. This credential grants full executive override access across all branches. And she placed the card back down gently, as if handling something that no longer belonged to routine procedure, but to something far beyond it. And across the room, the man in the navy suit exhaled, slowly shaking his head, once not in disbelief, but in recognition, as if a puzzle had finally aligned into a clear picture. While near the glass offices, the woman who had been recording lowered her phone completely, her attention now fully fixed on Jada, not as a subject, but as a presence. And still Jada did not raise her voice, did not step forward again. She simply allowed the moment to settle, because power, when real, does not need to rush. It allows others to arrive at the truth on their own. And then she spoke, her tone unchanged, but carrying a finality that had not been present before. You asked for verification, you questioned my access, and you attempted to remove me without confirming anything. And each statement was delivered without accusation, without emotion, just a sequence of facts placed where they could not be ignored. And Claudia finally responded, her voice quieter, now measured not out of calm, but out of necessity. If this is accurate, then there has been a misunderstanding. And the word misunderstanding lingered in the air briefly before dissolving under the weight of everything that had already happened. Because what had taken place was not confusion, it was assumption. And Jada's gaze remained steady as she replied, this was not a misunderstanding, it was a decision made before any information was verified. And the distinction mattered because it removed any possibility of reducing the moment to a simple error. It defined it as something systemic, something repeatable, something that had likely happened before. And behind the counter, the systems continued their quiet progression, screens updating access levels, shifting logs, recording every second that had passed since the initial interaction. And one of the tellers whispered softly, the audit is still running, it has not stopped. And that detail carried weight, because it meant the situation was no longer contained within the room. It had already extended beyond it, into records, into reports, into processes that would outlast this moment entirely. And Claudia's posture shifted again, not collapsing, but adjusting into something more grounded, less performative, as she looked directly at Jada and said, what would you like us to do to resolve this? And the question was simple, but it marked a complete reversal from where they had started. Because now it was not about enforcing protocol, it was about responding to authority. And Jada paused for a brief second, not because she needed time to decide, but because the moment required precision. And she said, first, we complete the transaction I requested, and we do it according to the same standards applied to any verified client. And there was no demand in her voice, no emphasis, just a clear expectation that did not invite negotiation. And the junior employee nodded, immediately turning back to her terminal, her hands moving with a confidence that had been absent before as the system unlocked her access in response to the executive credential. And across the room the silence remained, but it had changed again, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but attentive, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing not just a correction, but a standard being reset in real time. And Jada added quietly, without shifting her gaze, and after that, we address everything that happened here today. And that sentence did not raise the tension, it anchored it, because it made clear that this moment was not ending, it was transitioning into something larger, something that would extend beyond this room, into consequences, into accountability, into change. And for the first time since this began, Claudia did not interrupt, did not redirect. She simply nodded once, acknowledging not just the request, but the reality that had replaced everything she thought she controlled. The system unlocked not with a dramatic sound, but with a quiet sequence of confirmations that moved across the terminals one by one. Access restored under executive authority, permissions elevated, restrictions lifted, and the junior employee moved with a new level of precision, her earlier hesitation replaced by clarity, as she processed Jada Sterling's request exactly as it had been stated. No extra questions, no unnecessary delays, just the procedure done correctly, and that alone changed the tone of the room more than anything else, because it revealed how simple this interaction had always been before it was complicated by assumption. And Jada stood still, watching not the screens, not the employees, but the process itself unfolding as it should have from the beginning. And for a brief second, another memory surfaced, not as pain, but as contrast. A time when she had to explain her presence, justify her position, prove her legitimacy step by step in rooms that were built on her exclusion. And now those same structures responded instantly to her authority, not because they had changed on their own, but because she had changed them. And the transaction completed with a soft confirmation tone, the junior employee looking up to meet Jada's gaze, her voice steady and respectful. Your request has been processed successfully. Is there anything else you would like to review? And the phrasing was deliberate, not rehearsed, but aligned with a standard that had always existed but had not been applied equally. And Jada nodded once, acknowledging the completion before shifting her attention back to Claudia Reeves. And the room followed that shift instinctively, because everyone understood that the transaction had never been the central issue, it had only been the entry point. And Claudia stood there, no longer attempting to reclaim authority, but standing within the reality that had replaced it. Her posture more grounded, her expression more measured, as if she were now choosing each response with full awareness of its weight. And Jada spoke, her voice calm, but carrying further, now not louder, just clearer. You enforced protocol. Without verification, you assumed risk. Without evidence, and you escalated removal without cause. And each statement was placed with precision, not for confrontation, but for record. Because this was no longer a conversation, it was an account of what had happened. And Claudia listened, fully, not interrupting, not redirecting, because interruption would have implied control, and control no longer belonged to her in this moment. And a faint shift moved through the staff behind her, some standing straighter, others lowering their gaze, as the words settled into a collective awareness that this was not isolated, it was reflective of something broader, something embedded. And Jada continued, without changing her tone, the system responded exactly as it was designed to when executive authority is present. It paused operations, it initiated review, and it documented every interaction. And that last phrase, documented every interaction, landed with a quiet finality, because it meant nothing that had happened would disappear into interpretation or be softened by explanation. It was recorded exactly as it occurred. And across the room, the man in the navy suit crossed his arms slowly, not in defense, but in contemplation, as if he were witnessing a standard being defined in real time. While near the glass office, the woman who had been recording now held her phone at her side, her attention fully engaged, because what was happening no longer needed documentation to be understood, it needed recognition. And Claudia finally spoke, her voice steady, but lower than before. I acknowledged that the situation was not handled correctly. And the statement was simple, but it marked a shift from justification to accountability. And Jada held her gaze for a moment before responding. Acknowledgement is a starting point, not a resolution. And the distinction mattered because it made clear that this moment was not about apology, it was about consequence. And behind them, the system updated again, this time displaying audit log secured and escalation report generated. And the junior employee glanced at it briefly, then back to Jada, as if confirming that what had begun earlier had now fully completed its first phase. And Jada took a slow breath, not out of tension, but out of timing. Because the next words would define everything that followed. And she said, this branch will undergo a full operational review effective immediately, including conduct assessment, decision protocols, and escalation procedures. And there was no emphasis, no raised tone, just a statement of fact that carried more weight than any command. And Claudia nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition that the process had already begun before she was informed of it. And Jada added quietly, every client who walks into this space deserves to be evaluated by their information, not by assumption. And the room absorbed that sentence differently, because it extended beyond this moment, it reframed the standard itself. And for the first time since the interaction began, the silence that followed was not tense, not uncertain, but settled. Because what had been unclear was now defined not by who spoke the loudest, but by who held the truth. The silence that settled after Jada Sterling's words did not feel like an ending, it felt like a transition. As if the room itself had shifted from witnessing an incident to understanding a consequence already in motion. And the systems behind the counter reflected that shift with quiet precision, as new notifications appeared across multiple screens, access logs, sealed compliance flags issued, and internal review channels opened in sequence, each update subtle on its own, but together forming a pattern that could not be mistaken for routine operations. And the junior employee read one of the updates under her breath before looking up again, her voice steady. The escalation report has been forwarded to regional oversight and executive compliance. And that sentence extended the moment beyond the walls of the branch, making it clear that what had happened here was no longer contained within a single interaction. It was now part of a larger structure that would review it without bias, without interruption, and without the ability to be rewritten. And Claudia Reeves stood in that realization fully now, not resisting it, not attempting to redirect it, but standing within it as someone who understood that the narrative was no longer hers to manage. Her shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, and she said, "We will cooperate fully with the review process." And the statement carried a different weight than anything she had said before, because it did not attempt to control the outcome. It accepted that the outcome would be determined elsewhere by standards that could not be negotiated in this moment. And behind her the staff adjusted subtly, some stepping back from their stations, others standing still, but more aware than they had been minutes earlier, because the environment they operated in had just revealed itself to be something more structured, more accountable than it had appeared in daily routine. And across the room the man in the navy suit nodded, once quietly, as if confirming to himself that what he had just witnessed was not unusual because of the conflict, but because of the clarity that followed it. While near the glass office, the woman who had been recording placed her phone into her bag, no longer needing it, because the significance of the moment no longer depended on capturing it, it depended on understanding it. And Jada remained composed, her presence unchanged, not elevated, not performative, just aligned with the authority she had carried into the room from the beginning. And she spoke again, her tone calm, but definitive. "This review will not focus on a single action. It will examine the pattern that allowed that action to occur." And the distinction mattered because it shifted the focus from an isolated mistake to a system that either prevented or permitted it. And the junior employee listened closely, her expression thoughtful, as if she were already considering what that meant for the way things had been done before this moment. And another update appeared on the screen, this time more direct: interim management oversight assigned, pending review. And a quiet breath moved through the staff because they understood what that meant even without explanation. And Claudia saw it too, her gaze dropping briefly to the notification before returning to Jada, not with resistance, but with acceptance, because the process had moved beyond conversation into action. And Jada added without raising her voice, "This is not about removal. It is about correction and clarity." And that sentence reframed the outcome not as punishment, but as a recalibration of standards. And the room absorbed that differently because it offered direction, not just consequence. And for a moment no one spoke because there was nothing left to question. The structure had been set, the process had begun, and the authority behind it was no longer abstract. It was present, visible, and undeniable. And then Jada turned slightly, her attention shifting not away from the situation but through it, as if acknowledging that the moment had reached its necessary conclusion. And she said, "Ensure that every client who enters this branch from this point forward is met with verification before assumption and respect before conclusion." And the words were not delivered as a lesson, they were delivered as a standard, something that would exist long after this moment had passed. And the junior employee nodded immediately, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. And Claudia followed with a single nod as well, not as agreement, but as recognition that the expectation was now defined clearly and permanently. And the systems behind them continued their quiet work, recording final timestamps, securing logs, and preparing documentation that would outlast the memory of the moment itself. And as the room settled into this new understanding, the earlier tension no longer lingered because it had been replaced with something more stable, something grounded in clarity. And Jada Sterling stood for one final second in that space, not to confirm her authority, but to allow the standard she had just reinforced to settle fully into the environment. And then, without urgency, without announcement, she turned and began to walk toward the exit. Her steps measured, her presence unchanged, leaving behind not silence, but a structure that had been tested, corrected, and now clearly defined. The glass doors closed behind Jada Sterling with a soft, controlled click that barely registered in the soundscape of downtown Chicago. But inside the branch, it marked a clear and undeniable divide between what the space had been and what it had just become. And for a few seconds, no one moved, not because they were frozen, but because they were recalibrating. Each person in that room adjusting to a new understanding that had not been announced, but had been demonstrated with precision, and the systems continued their quiet confirmations, final audit locks, secured compliance notifications, dispatched oversight channels active, each line of text appearing and disappearing with the same calm authority that had defined Jada's presence from the beginning. And behind the counter, the junior employee exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering as she looked at the screen one more time before glancing toward the entrance where Jada had just exited, her expression thoughtful, not overwhelmed, not confused, but aware that she had just witnessed something that would change the way she approached every interaction moving forward. And beside her, another teller leaned slightly closer, whispering, "I have never seen the system respond like that before." And the junior employee answered without hesitation, it did exactly what it was supposed to do. And that distinction mattered because it shifted the narrative from surprise to design, from anomaly to intention. And across the room, the man in the navy suit picked up his coffee again, but did not drink it immediately, his gaze still directed toward the door, as if replaying the sequence in his mind, not the conflict, but the resolution. While near the glass office, the woman who had recorded earlier adjusted her posture, then spoke quietly to herself, "That is what accountability looks like. Not loud, not chaotic, just undeniable." And Claudia Reeves remained near the center of the space, not in the same stance she had held earlier, but in a position that reflected awareness rather than control. Her eyes moved briefly across the staff, then toward the screens, then finally toward the entrance. And for the first time since this began, she did not attempt to define the moment, she simply stood within it. And after a pause, she said, "We will review every step of what occurred and ensure it does not happen again." And her voice carried a different tone, now not authority, not defense, but commitment, shaped by the recognition that standards had just been made visible in a way that could not be ignored. And the staff responded not with words, but with subtle shifts, nods of understanding, quiet movements back to their stations, not as a return to routine, but as a continuation under new awareness. And the systems behind them reflected that as well, new prompts appearing on screens, updated verification protocols, reminders of compliance steps that had always existed, but would now be applied with clarity rather than assumption. And outside the building, Jada walked at a steady pace, her reflection briefly visible in the glass panels that carried her name across the facade. And she did not look back because she did not need to. The correction had already been made, the standard had already been set. And as she reached the curb, a car pulled up smoothly, the driver stepping out to open the door, but she paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of reflection. Because moments like this were not new, they were part of a pattern she had seen for years in different forms, different places, different voices. And yet each time she chose the same response, not confrontation, not escalation, but clarity followed by action. And she stepped into the car, the door closing with the same quiet precision as the one she had left behind. And as the vehicle moved into traffic, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside one of its many buildings. But inside that branch, something had changed in a way that would not fade with time, because it was no longer based on who spoke the loudest or who assumed the most. It was grounded in a standard that had been demonstrated without force and without question. And back inside the bank, the junior employee typed in the final note of the transaction, then paused before submitting it, reading the line once more before pressing enter. And in that simple action, there was a difference, now a level of attention, a level of care that had not been there before. And the system accepted the entry with a soft confirmation, and the screen returned to its normal state, but the room did not. Because what had been corrected was not just a process, it was a perspective. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of resumed operations, the earlier words, "You do not belong here," no longer carried authority. They carried a lesson, one that would remain long after the memory of the moment itself began to fade. Because in the end, nothing about that morning had required volume or force, it had required truth. And truth, once revealed, does not need to be repeated, it simply remains.